There we go. Well, firstly, thank you very much, Peter and Alice, for inviting me to be part of today's session. As Peter said, my name is Jessica Elleray, and I work for Oxford Archaeology, who are one of the UK's leading archaeological units. Prior to working for Oxford, I worked as a research artist on art and archaeology projects with a focus on raising public awareness for the illicit trafficking of heritage and archaeology at risk. Now, today I'm going to be presenting to you a distilled version of my master's thesis, exploring how archaeology is represented in popular simulation video games and the impact this has on players. And whilst the focus of the research was on archaeology, it is understood that the discipline does not exist in isolation, and the ethical concerns regarding context, provenance, colonialism, and looting are shared with museums, art market actors, and paleontologists, among others. So these subjects were also considered where they arose in the games. Archaeology is both the subject and setting of many video games. Pictured here are two wildly different examples, which both adapt ancient Egyptian archaeological sites, Assassin's Creed Origins and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Research to date has predominantly focused on the action, strategy, and adventure genres, typically finding archaeological representations to be inaccurate and unethical. Therefore, the first goal of this research was to address the genre gap by identifying whether unethical archaeological representation is limited to these genres, or if it exists across the video game industry. The simulation genre was chosen for two reasons. Firstly, because the use and adaptation of simulations is familiar to archaeology, and secondly, because at the most basic level, these games aim to simulate some aspect of real life. And this has very interesting implications for the second goal of this study, which is to understand how these representations might impact player behavior. Now, since writing my thesis in 2020, the genre gap is thankfully no longer quite so glaring, with other archaeogaming researchers such as Kingsland beginning to ask their own questions of simulation games, thereby further expanding our understanding of this genre. Two case studies were chosen for this study, The Sims 4 Jungle Adventure and Animal Crossing New Horizons. They were chosen because they allow players to conduct excavation, and they are exceedingly popular with their audiences. The Sims is one of the most popular PC franchises of all time, and New Horizons sold 13.41 million units in the first 6 weeks after launch alone. Both these games are large and complex, and for this study, I focused on the game's narrative and mechanics. To those unfamiliar with gaming terminology, the mechanics are the rules and structures which determine the boundaries within which players can interact with the game and exercise their own creativity. These case studies were analysed using narrative research methodology. It's an excellent method for identifying themes and narrative devices, which also allowed me to acknowledge the subjectivity of my own experience as a player. It's worth noting that multiplayer aspects of the games were not analysed, and both games have been updated since and may now feature new mechanics not discussed here. For example, at the time of study, New Horizons only allowed for the excavation of fossils. Recent updates have added gyroids, statues that play music, and are based off ancient Japanese Haniwa sculptures, which were buried with the dead. As you can imagine, this raises its own set of questions, but they're not addressed in this study. I do, however, intend to explore this in a future addendum. Data on the games was recorded through screenshots, audio recordings, and handwritten notes, then transcribed and analysed to discern patterns and outline data. These observations were given coded categories such as setting, excavation, ethics, then clustered to identify where the observations originated, whether that be in the narrative of the game, its mechanics, or from my own experience and perceptions. Now, we don't have time to look at the findings in full detail, but I've picked some key elements to share with you today. So starting with The Sims 4 Jungle Adventure. In Jungle Adventure, archaeology can only be conducted at the holiday destination of Selva Dorada, an exotic jungle complete with waterfalls, Mesoamerican-inspired temples, and Spanish colonial architecture. The name comes across as a play on El Dorado, bringing up images of Spanish treasure fleets exploiting locals in a race for gold. And there are two cultures in Selva Dorada, the Amiskans, an ancient civilization who supposedly built the temple and ruins, and the Salvadoradans who currently live in the area and run the marketplace. Now, players meet many Salvadoradans, but never any Amiskans, and the connection between these cultures and their history is never explained. I cannot believe that game designers were unaware of the colonial culture they were presenting here, and from an archaeological perspective, this is a past we're actively trying to address, not enthusiastically reinforce, as is happening here. Moving on to stereotypes, the Indiana Jones adventure stereotype was everywhere, from the adventure outfits to the "it belongs in a museum" messages when you donated your artifacts to museums. There were curses, booby traps, treasure hunting, walking skeletons, all tropes that archaeology is famous for in popular culture. The excavation mechanic was actually a wonderful surprise. It didn't acknowledge context, and even my attempts to keep an archaeological context index were unfortunately undermined by the game's stacking artifacts, so I could never tell what actually came from where. However, it made more effort than I've experienced in a game before to demonstrate the different processes involved in archaeological practice, from taking photographs and recording to analysing and conserving. The game also acknowledged that archaeology is a skill that you have to hone over time, something which is demonstrated in this table here, which goes through the different levels that you can achieve in the game. The ethics reflected in the game mechanics and narrative are really poor, unfortunately. I've already mentioned the problematic colonial setting. Whilst there were positive aspects to the excavation mechanic and skill tree, ultimately in-game excavation was little different from real-world looting. Add to this taking artifacts across borders, selling them without concern, being asked to authenticate artifacts for money. The game mechanics had players enacting potential heritage crimes and illicit activities, but at no point presented them as such. This screenshot here shows one example where choosing the ethical option of leaving this statue in situ nearly resulted in the death of my character. So there's actually little incentive for players to behave ethically, nor any structure to help them identify good or bad professional practice. In comparison, Animal Crossing: New Horizons makes little of the adventure stereotype, instead making more use of the image of the pure scholar in the form of Blathers the museum curator, who is this owl here on screen. Although it's set on an exotic island, this is part of the overall game narrative rather than specifically connected to excavation, and therefore the setting doesn't have quite the same impact as Salvadorada. That being said, later in the game, you are encouraged to visit other mystery islands and apply a finders keepers rule. So whilst the colonial overtones are not as overt, they are still present with this idea that you can go somewhere and claim whatever you like and take it away with you. Excavation is fairly simple in comparison to The Sims. You find cracks in the ground, stick your shovel in, and voila, you have a fossil. These are then identified for you by Blathers, the curator. Players' in-game discoveries of fossils, insects, fish, and art all have real-world counterparts. And what's uniquely interesting about Animal Crossing games is that using these discoveries to build a museum for the benefit of your community is a driving feature of the game narrative. It's key, particularly at the beginning of the game. You couldn't ignore it even if you wanted to. Also, when you donate to the museum, Blathers will teach you about your donation. And in this way, the game designers have not only highlighted the cultural value of our museums, but they use the mechanic as an opportunity to educate players about their own world. This is a real strength of the game. This theme of valuing knowledge and presenting museums as cultural and scientific spaces is reflected in the internal design of the museum, which I have to say, in my personal opinion, is absolutely stunning. On a less positive note, we have the in-game art market and Red the Fox. He's a rather shady individual who visits the island on his boat, the Jolly Red Treasure Trawler. He sells artworks, one of which per week will be genuine and the others will all be fake. Red is the only way, as far as I experienced in gameplay, for players to collect the artwork they need to complete their museum. In this way, the game justifies illegal activity under the guise of cultural development. As I'm sure many of you know, this is not an unfamiliar scenario in museum and art market practice even today, sometimes being justified as the saving of artifacts. So how is archaeology represented in the simulation genre? Of course, this is only a snapshot of the overall findings from this study, but even this is enough to demonstrate that the same stereotypes and colonial messages seen in action, strategy, and adventure games are repeated in this genre. Whilst there is some complexity, the games reduce archaeology to basic excavation and analysis, all while ignoring the fundamental principle of context. Artifacts are valued for their financial and aesthetic qualities, with New Horizons thankfully also celebrating scientific and cultural values in a really refreshing way. Foregrounding the value of our museums and the collections they hold to society is a real strength of Animal Crossing, but the surrounding mechanics rather undermine this positive message by reinforcing unethical behaviour. Both games actively encourage uncritical engagement with illicit art markets and present looting behaviour as equivalent to archaeological excavation in a professional context. Even our trusted scholar is guilty. Blathers does not exercise appropriate due diligence when taking donations of art for the museum, and he often considers buying your duplicates for his personal collection, never mind the continued value of duplicates to the wider community and to science as a whole. So what's the impact on players? Why should we care about how archaeology is represented in our video games? Surely they're just a little bit of fun. Well, there's a lot of research on this, and again, my paper goes into greater detail, but we've only got time for some headlines here. So headline number 1. While researchers don't agree on whether games cause violence, they do agree that video games desensitize players to violence. Sickart argues, and this is headline number 2, that players are not the victims of unethical games because they're empowered agents who choose what to play, can reflect on their in-game actions, and then differentiate between their own ethics and those of the game itself. Our third and final headline, fiction is key. Taverner states that if what was fictionally occurring in the world of Grand Theft Auto was genuinely occurring, the player would not be enjoying it quite so much. So how does this apply to our case studies? Well, firstly, if players are at risk of being desensitized to the most violent of crimes, then we have to accept that they're also at risk of being desensitized to unethical and in some cases clearly illegal archaeological activity by playing these games. We also know that they're less able to act as empowered agents, something which Sickart requires in order for them to avoid harm. This is because firstly, audiences are ill-equipped to identify unethical practice due to its prevalence in popular culture. And secondly, the audiences for these games include children, span very wide age ranges, and children are not necessarily mature enough to exercise the critical self-reflection required to protect themselves from harm. In this way, Sickart's research outlining how to protect players from unethical games actually reinforces just how harmful our case studies have the potential to be. Lastly, to consider Taverner's point that the fiction of the game is key, well, these games are not pure fiction. In fact, they aim to emulate and reflect real life in very tangible ways, with New Horizons going so far as to mirror the seasons and weather of a player's real world. During play, I found myself looking closer at the creatures living in my garden and suddenly being able to identify different species of butterfly that I never had before. And this is a clear example of my gameplay changing my real life experience and understanding of the world. Boom et al. Argued that high quality video game graphics could mislead players to believing in-game representations over actual evidence. Following from their thinking then, a game which simulates real life to such an extent is actually primed to mislead player understanding of how to relate to archaeology. Moving forward, I would recommend further research into additional simulation games to add to our understanding of this genre. And I'd also recommend a participant study to closely examine how players are impacted by playing these games. These are both very important steps to corroborating the findings of this study. Now, something I haven't particularly addressed in great detail in this presentation are the decisions that I made as a player to try and overcome the mechanics and game narratives that I found uncomfortable. And I haven't addressed this largely because before we look at how players adapt, we need to understand the foundations they're being given by game designers. I also didn't want to address it because I'm far from a typical player, coming at these games with research questions and specialist knowledge of archaeological ethics and heritage crime, which could warp the interpretation and impression. However, player freedom and creativity is a core feature of many simulation games, and research into if, how, and why players overcome these in-game mechanics would also prove really insightful. I believe the simulation genre actually offers unique opportunities for the development of an ethically conscious archaeology video game. The same elements that make these games really good at reinforcing unethical behavior position them to be excellent at teaching good practice. Data from a survey conducted by Moll et al. Suggested that an ethical archaeology game would not be fun or popular. But simulation games have this really strange ability to make the most mundane tasks fun, from completing homework in The Sims to picking weeds in Animal Crossing. And we as archaeological professionals know better than anyone that our practice and processes are far from boring. As with any material culture, games reflect the societies that make them. They reveal popular perspectives and ideologies, but they also have the power to change them. If the archaeological and wider heritage community are remotely concerned about the representation of their discipline, about preserving the archaeological record and decolonizing their foundations, if, in other words, they value their own ethical ideals and principles, they must seriously consider the messages widely shared through video games and other cultural mediums and actively work to produce ethically conscious content. Thank you very much.